Okay. Okay, so welcome to topic number 11, death and loss. It's been said that living Jewishly means dying Jewishly as well. So the goal of this session is to open up a conversation about Jewish thought and practice and rituals around dying and death. This module, as I said, encompasses a vast range of human experience, and we'll all hopefully be able to discuss as we go through everything. So the materials were written by Rabbi Joe Blair. He's a rabbi, but he's also deeply involved in teaching about Jewish end-of-life matters through the Gamliel Institute. The Gamliel Institute is a project of Kavod V'Nichum, which means honor and comfort. It's a North American organization that provides assistance, training, and resources about Jewish death and bereavement practice for Chevra Kadisha groups and bereavement committees in synagogues and communities in the U.S. and Canada. So Rabbi Joe edits a blog called, I love this, Expired and Inspired for Kavod V'Nichum. So there's some interesting supplemental materials that I'll point you towards also. But starting out in this session, we're going to focus on Nichum Hagoses, which means comforting the dying, Kavod Hamet, which is responding at the moment of death, Nichum Avelim, which is comforting the mourners. And it's a selection, it's a starting point for further learning and discussion. Joe Blair is very, very, very thorough. So there's a lot in here, and there are like pages full of supplemental materials. So that's really a very deep look into this topic. Of Jewish teachings and tradition, ritual and practice encompasses everything from visiting the sick to remembrance to Jewish views of the afterlife. So the goal of this session is to open a conversation. So please feel free to talk. And there are some people on the screen because they came early. Now that I've started, I see other people are here. Please feel very free to use the chat box. I'm really interested in what you have to say, what you think about, or questions that you might have. It's a framework that we can build as a group, experiencing this often shunned, frequently taboo topic. And when you do this with your own groups, I think the participants are going to recognize that overcoming this avoidance and denial and fear of discussion about death, because it is a natural part of life, overcoming this will help them define for themselves what it means to have a good death, or more importantly, a good life. So again, there's going to be a wide range of responses, and please feel free to respond as I'm going through the texts. Some people might have personal experience with the loss of a loved one. Some might be contemplating their own mortality. And it's easy for the discussion to veer off in different ways, and that's fine. So it's a very, very rich module. There's a lot there. And the idea is when you're doing it, you might want to focus on certain of the text, look through beforehand and see what you want to do. You might have your group members also look through in advance and maybe choose what you want to do, because there's a lot of info here. So you might want to do that in advance. Oops, I just unshared. What I was trying to do was this. We have our agenda. You can see it's long. There are 18 texts. So I'm going to get right started with themes. Okay, and here are the themes. Death is a natural aspect of life. That's very important. You'll see when we get to the text. Tradition provides us with a framework within which our personal responses will be guided by our own values, given the many factors at play in any situation. Every death is the same, yet infinitely different, just like people. When we care for the dead and for the mourners, we're acting in God's ways, and our lives are enhanced both personally and communally. And the last question, what does it mean to have a good death, and more importantly, a good life? That's what we're going to be thinking about as we go through these texts. Okay, so I'm going to start with text 1. Okay, this is from the Babylonian Talmud. It describes a conversation based on a previous statement of Rabbi Eliezer in Pirkei Avot, which is another part of the Talmud. When his students questioned the practicality of his suggestion, Rabbi Eliezer illuminated the difference between sporadic activity and a mindful way of living. So, as we were told in the Talmud, we learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer says, repent one day before your death. Rabbi Eliezer's students asked him, but does a person know the day on which he will die? And he said to them, all the more so, this is a good piece of advice. One should repent today, lest he die tomorrow. And by following this advice, one will spend his entire life in a state of repentance. King Solomon also said in his wisdom, at all times, your clothes should be white, and oil shall not be absent from upon your head, which means that a person always needs to be prepared. So basically, what we're saying is, if you are living so that when you die, you are good, you've achieved something, or you've done what you're here on earth to do, or you've been a good person, if you're trying to do that by the time you die, why not just do that every day, basically? And then text 2, which I also have up here, it's drawn from a book of commentary, and it describes the response of Rabbi Simcha Bunim to his imminent death. It's a very brief statement directed to his wife who's with him. It's not an exchange of last words that we might expect between a husband and wife. It almost sounds like a rebuke rather than comforting her. We can easily imagine what her state might be, her emotional state, but it raises many questions about his feelings and thoughts. So Rabbi Simcha Bunim lay dying, and he heard his wife weeping. He said to her, why do you cry? Have not all the days of my life only been so that I might teach myself how to die? So death can be a great teacher for those who can see in the proper light. When we only contemplate it in pain at the time of our loss, we cannot see it clearly. When we allow fear or denial to cloud or prevent our contemplation of it, we're poorer for it. So even from a personal standpoint, I remember my grandfather. He's a really great guy. And he was in his 90s, and he was dying. And we were all there at the hospital. We got there. We ran to Florida. First thing he goes is, what time is it? We said 12:45. He says, go eat lunch. I'm not dead yet. We all came back. He was a great guy. And he said, look, I'm 95 years old. I buried 2 wives. I don't want any crying. We're done. And it's just interesting because everybody's different. But he basically felt he'd done what he was here to do, and he didn't want anybody to feel bad. Of course, we were all sad because we were going to miss him. Here, Rabbi Simcha Bunim says, I spent my whole life doing what I need to do, and now I'm finished. And so what's your problem, kind of? So it's interesting that dying might be sort of like a birthday, like you're measuring whether you've done what you came here to do. I think that's kind of the gist of this. Any questions or comments before I go on? Okay. Okay, so let's go to text 3. Here it's interesting. Judaism distinguishes between a person who's ill, which we call hacholeh, or one who's in their final days, which is hagosis. A sick person is generally expected to recover and return to what's normal life for them. So this might be a person with a mild or inconvenient illness, like a cold, measles, a broken arm. It might include more serious, more chronic issues, like allergies, which I don't consider that serious, but diabetes. All the same, the expectation is that these persons are going to recover from this episode, and they're going to continue to live. A gosis, on the other hand, is an individual whose prognosis is terminal. Technically, a gosis is a person who's expected to die within 72 hours. But historically, and even today, it's not possible to know precisely when you're going to die. So it's kind of a best guess. And those in the presence of a gosis were obliged to behave differently than with someone who's ill. The focus is no longer primarily on treatment or care or cure. Instead, it's on elevating comfort, limiting or eliminating pain. This model is used in hospice very much today. And so the next section focuses on the dying, the mitzvah of nichum hagosis, comfort of the dying, and how we're supposed to do that. So Jewish tradition has addressed this issue over the centuries. It's not a list of instructions, really, but it's a set of tools that can be used as we face the many decisions involved in care at the end of life. How do we respond thoughtfully to a sequence of events that we're never really sufficiently prepared to encounter? So this text is from the mid-1500s. So as we read it, think about what these traditions that made sense in the 1500s, what they mean in terms of today. It implies the ways that a Chevra Kadisha undertakes the rituals of preparing someone who's dead and guarding the body. and also comforting the dying as well as comforting the mourners. There are multiple manuals and sets of instructions for how this work is to be done, but in the end, it's really the custom that prevails, that people decide what to do. Okay, so one who is dying is like a living person for all his affairs. In other words, you're not going to start to prepare this person for death. In those days, you're not going to dye his cheeks. They're not going to anoint him. They do not wash him. They do not announce about him to the cities. They do not hire flutists and lamenters, and do not close his eyes until his soul departs. And anyone who closes with the departure of the soul, behold, this one spills blood. And similarly, it is forbidden to place the keys of the synagogue under his head in order that he take leave. So clearly that's not something we do today. We don't do things to help a person die, but we're talking about euthanasia here. That in those days, they put the key of the synagogue under his head. If there's something there that is causing delay in the departure of the soul, such as if there is a banging noise next to that house, such as a wood chopper, or there is salt on his tongue, obviously in the 1500s, this would help to keep him alive. If that kind of thing is happening, it's permitted to remove it from there. That in this, there is no activity at all, rather that you're removing a barrier. So we could kind of compare this in the light of modern medicine to, we're talking about euthanasia versus medical intervention is life-sustaining. I think that's what we're talking about. So how does this text recognize the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual needs of the patient and of the family that we're talking about? Does anybody want to say anything or have a comment? Okay, then I'm going to go with, if you've had a relative, sadly, who's been in hospice, I think it's a real, it's a fight within yourself. You don't want to lose them, but very much the person you're losing is probably already not really there. I remember when my father-in-law passed away, he was in hospice for a long time, and they stopped prolonging his life, and he still hung on for a while, but the person that was there, he was ready to go, and we had to deal with it. So it's managing the potential conflict between our emotional responses and traditional approach that's important here, and between our emotional responses and something that's out there that's bigger than ourselves. This is what this is talking about. And I think it could really, it could be the initial of, it could start a really interesting conversation about euthanasia and prolonging life and everything in between. That's something to think about when we do this with our group.
Nina, can I say something?
Yes, please.
That to me, and it's very emotional for me because I was in that position with my mother, but that's when it becomes selflessness versus selfishness, and when you're able to say palliative care is okay and realize that you need to do the right thing. And I think that's what Judaism is saying, that you have to think of the others before, which is why we say Kaddish.
Exactly. And this text in itself is trying to give us a guide, and saying it's okay to stop the care that's keeping them alive if you can do that. And so, yeah, it's obviously throughout our lives and the lives of everyone who came before us has been an issue that's been hard to deal with. And that's why it's a very important conversation to have. So thanks for sharing. So texts 4 through 7 kind of go together. They're all about how we view a dying person and what we should hope and pray for. Especially text 5 is interesting. It introduces the concept that there's a need to balance values, like we were talking about, in the pull of life, the fear of loss, the natural order of living things. The dying person and their loved ones might be at odds. I've had relatives who were really ready to go when I wasn't ready to say goodbye. So as I read the text, look at the questions on the slide and think about how what I'm reading relates to each of them. Okay, the first one's short. The human soul is the lamp of God. That's from Proverbs. The next one is a favorite of some of the people I've done this with. It's related that on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. And they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi has died will be stabbed with a sword. They clearly did not want to hear that info. The maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi ascended to the roof and said, the upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will upon the upper worlds. In other words, he should stay alive. However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom and remove his phylacteries and then exit and put them back on, how he was suffering with his intestinal disease, she said, may it be the will of God that the upper worlds should impose their will upon the lower worlds. And the sages, meanwhile, would not be silent. They would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehudi HaNasi would not die. So the maidservant took a jug and threw it from the roof to the ground. Due to the sudden noise, the sages were momentarily silent and refrained from begging for mercy. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. I'll go to the next text. It seems to me that there are times when it is necessary to pray that he die, as for example, if the sick person suffers greatly, and it is in any case impossible for him to continue living much longer. Okay. And the next one, text 7, is about what a sick person should do. A sick person should be encouraged to settle his affairs. We tell the patient that he should attend to his affairs. If he owes or is owed money, but he should not take this inquiry as evidence that he's dying and become afraid. In other words, you don't want to scare the patient and make them take care of their affairs because you don't really want to remind them that they're dying. You want them to feel okay. Then say to someone who is leaning towards death, confess. Say to him, many have confessed and they will not die. In other words, we're not telling you to confess because you're dying, we're just telling you to confess. And many that do not confess, they will die. And in the wage that you confess, you live. And all that have confessed, that is his part in the world to come. If one is not able to confess by his own mouth, he can confess in his heart. If he's not able to know how to confess, say it for him. I say, and then fill it in. All of these are things which he is unable to say before ordinary people, and not before women and not before children, lest they weep, and the sound of their cries breaks his heart. So they're not only dealing with the way the dying person feels about dying, they're dealing with the way he feels about the people that he's leaving behind. So they don't want to get his relatives upset in front of him because they don't want to upset him further. That's an interesting thing. So let's look at our questions. So how do these texts relate to the core values of Nichum HaGoses? I think we've been discussing this as we go along. If anybody would like to comment, I'd love to hear it. Okay. How do we best honor the experience of the dying person? Is it bad or wrong to pray for someone's release from suffering? How is this related to the desire for a good death or death with dignity? I think there's even life with dignity. I think sometimes we see someone in the hospital or someone suffering at home and they have lost their dignity, and it's very hard. How do these texts address assisted death or euthanasia? How do we view the various costs to society of keeping people alive at all costs? These are really interesting discussions, and there's not going to be one answer. There's going to be a lot of opinions, I think. And I think it'll be really interesting next time we get together to hear what the people you discuss this with, what the other Chai Mitzvah participants said. Do you see any progression, evolution, or changes of view in the text as time passes? These texts are in chronological order. And I think in some ways we do see a change, but you know, the first one, the human soul is the lamp of God. Well, I think that's pretty classic. I think that the emotions stay the same. Certainly we don't believe nowadays that if you drop a jug off the roof, people will stop praying, the person will die. But we do believe that if you turn off their ventilator, they might die. And it's a similar thought, similar emotions and choice that's really hard to make. So that is probably one of the hardest ones, because this is the moment before death, and that is probably the hardest time. You don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know what to think, and you feel as if you might actually have a choice, or like as if what you do might actually influence what's going to happen. I think that's a very hard thing. Um, and in that same time, it's not commonly known, but there's a Jewish tradition of deathbed confession. You know, we see in the movies they always get a priest because they're dying, but there's also a Jewish deathbed confession, and it's called the Vidui, which is the same as the confessional prayers we say on Yom Kippur, and it's referenced in the Shema every night. Um, and so I have here some questions, but I'm going to read you the two texts that relate to that. One is a shortened version of the traditional text, and then the next one's a modern interpretation. And it's interesting when you do this, compare the two texts, and it can be very enlightening. There are long and short versions of the Vidui, and there's a Sephardic version also, and they're all in the website, which you'll see in the supplemental sources if you go to the back of the book. So first, I'm going to read you the short version, and that is very traditional. I acknowledge before you, Hashem, my God and God of my fathers, that my recovery or death is in your hands. May it be your will that you heal me completely. But if I die, may my death be an atonement for all the mistakes, sins, and rebellions I have erred, sinned, and rebelled before you. May my portion be in Gan Eden. May you allow me to be in the world to come, which lies in store for the righteous. So I think one thought that really stuck out to me when I read this, I have a pretty good Jewish education, and I never was told that death could be an atonement for mistakes. So that to me was a new thought. Has anybody here have a comment or a thought on that? Has anybody else been told that or thought that? No, me neither. So I mean, I know that on Rosh Hashanah, you know, people they may be still in the book of life, and I guess if you take that thought further, maybe your death is in some way an atonement. But I don't think that is in common Jewish belief. So that's something that I'd love to hear what your participants think about that when the time comes. The next thing I'm going to read is long. It's from that, the blog Inspired and Inspired, the Kavod B'Niflam blog. I just love that title. This is not written by Rabbi Joe Blair, but it's in his blog. And first of all, I'll tell you, the woman who wrote it, her name is Lori Dinnerstein Kurz. And first I'm going to tell you what she says about it, and then I'll read it to you. She said, and I think she is an end-of-life person, as I have sat with so many people as they were dying, I never felt comfortable listening to or reading the traditional standard Vidui as it is. It's dark, it's filled with gloom, that not one of the patients I have shared the Vidui with, I believe, felt comforted, or felt atoned for, or even wanted to complete it. At a time when they need to make peace with themselves, with others, and God, reading such a joyless, depressing, and wicked review of what may not even describe their life is too burdensome, oppressive, and onerous at such a time. You probably know this prayer from Yom Kippur. We go through everything. We say we've done everything. And it's beautiful because we're all saying it together. And we're saying we've done things that we might not have done, but maybe the person next to us did, and we don't want to make them feel like they're the only one. So it makes sense on Yom Kippur, but it does not seem to make sense with Jewish people today who are dying. Is there no room to give praise and thanks for the many good things one was blessed and allowed to have done in a lifetime? Well, undoubtedly, we've all sinned to some degree. Few people I know identify with being as horrific as inferred to by the Vidui traditional text. If we are to atone for our sins before we die, we should apologize for and acknowledge the sins we are aware of, or even those we are not aware of, and take ownership of our sins. It seems to me that for many people, a more genuine and authentic confession would be a more honest accounting of one's own errors. I believe a more realistic, positive way of doing it would be very appropriate and would bring comfort and closure. So what follows is her version of a vidui that she shared with some patients who requested it when they had the chance to speak about prayer, meditation, and the vidui long before it was necessary. Okay, so here's what she's written. And listen to this and compare it to what I read before or what you know from Yom Kippur, and you can see how you feel about this. Hashem, as I am soon to come before you at the final closing of my eyes, I long to repent for any sins and to apologize for any errors of my ways. My Creator, I ask that you forgive my trespasses as a first step in allowing me to improve my soul. God, I am here before you, as I will shortly leave this life for the next. I pray that you will accept my sincere atonement of any wrong deeds, thoughts, or words for which I have been responsible. Lord, while I lie here contemplating my last breaths, I entreat you to forgive my iniquities, those that I am aware of and for which I repent, and those I am unaware of and yet regret. I come before you asking your forgiveness, as the thought of my errors weighs heavily upon me and gives me no peace. Creator of all life, as I review my life and concede to having made mistakes, I need to believe in my Creator as a forgiving God, as the one who acknowledges that we humans make mistakes and will forgive me. Elohim, my head is bowed, my knees are shaking, and I am before you as a lost sheep looking for my shepherd, who gives me security and keeps me on the right path to warrant redemption. Author of life, my spirit is soaring with jubilation as my neshama, soul, is soon to rejoin others in Olam Haba, the world to come. My spirit and soul will no longer be contained in this body, but will sense elation as they return to you, my Creator. Eloheinu, while my body is weakened, my spirit is strengthened, knowing that when I finally close my eyes here, my neshama will witness the wonders that are hidden from me here, and will see the beauty that is there. Holy One, I am saddened to be going on this journey so soon, as you've created wonderful works here. But I welcome with an open heart your decisions, though I do not understand them. Author of life, therefore, may all my iniquities, sins, trespasses, and errors be erased, as I am completely prepared to acknowledge all my failures and flaws and apologize for them with all my heart. For any wrongdoings against others, I ask their forgiveness. For any and all transgressions committed against you, I subserviently ask your mercy and compassion. O merciful one, while it is true that others may have had evil thoughts and spoke with malice and acted in ways not according to your will, I hope and pray that I was worthy of your blessings more often than I was worthy of your wrath. I earnestly believe I tried to do as you would prescribe, but confess I also earnestly believe that when I fell short, it was human error for which I atone at this time. May Hashem, who created the world and all that is in it, and who also created mankind with the ability to make choices, I ask in all humility that you accept my words of remorse, regret, and sorrow for any deeds or words that I may have chosen that did not bring you glory. Baruch Hashem, may it be your will to find my prayer acceptable in your sight. Amen. Okay, so that's a very long vidui. What's interesting in it, there's no specific things that the person apologizes for. There's thanks to God for the good, and it sounds almost like they're looking forward to the next step in their life. So they clearly believe in an afterlife. And that's something I'm not sure that all Jewish people do. Personally, I do, but I don't think that that's a prerequisite to being Jewish. So I'm interested in your thoughts, and then we can look over the conversation for the text as well. Actually, we can start with that. Do we see God as omnipotent or limited? Do you have a smile, Donna? What do you think?
It's quite interesting. I've really never thought about this. I was aware of a vidui. I knew what it was. I don't know that in the case of my father, who died of an instant heart attack, had the opportunity to do this. And he was very young. I find it interesting. I'm not sure I can wrap my arms around it.
It kind of relates back for a person who does die very young or suddenly to the idea of living every day as if it's our last day.
Right, exactly.
Yes, as I'm reading, because I'm a little cynical, I'm thinking, I hope the person is strong enough to get through this whole long text.
Right. I've also been part of a hospice team.
Oh, wow.
And it's very interesting. I was the only Jewish member on the team, and I was not singled out as being Jewish. As a matter of fact, the team was, the hospital situation was St. Francis of Assisi. Although, honestly, I thought they very fairly approached their mission in a very, I wouldn't say a secular, it was a very fair approach to all religions. So I find this really, really fascinating, having been on a hospice team.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I read this 2 or 3 days ago, and then I followed you as you read it again, and I'm wondering if I would have, in dying, whether I would have the ability to read this and to really say this out loud. Hopefully in my life, I've thought of these things. So it's a part of living Jewishly. Whether or not I would have the ability to do this at the point of death, I don't know. I find it fascinating. I happen to be married to a lovely guy who thinks he's an atheist and doesn't believe in any of this. So when we get done, I'm going to have him read this and see what he thinks. It's a very, very fascinating part of life, the end of life. And it really has made me stop and think. It's very deep, very deep.
It is. And I think that it's really great to have this discussion, especially because it makes us examine our lives. You know,
Yes.
thinking about death makes you examine your life. And that's, I think, very important.
Yep.
So, and we talk about how we reconcile the idea of personal judgment, reward, and punishment, and the need to atone with concepts of God's abundant forgiveness. So, one thing I want to say is that, you know, things we've done that hurt other people, God can't forgive us for. The people have to forgive
The
us.
people have to forgive us.
And that's something to think of also in this situation. And then the question is death God's judgment or punishment? That's not something that I've been taught is a Jewish concept. So it'd be very interesting to see what people think about this. And by the way, people who are not on the screen, if you want to type in the chat box, you know, please feel free. And then can death be viewed as an atonement today? And it's interesting that they ask today because I don't think death is thought of as an atonement today by most people. Maybe certain traditional people or certain people may see it that way. And also this whole idea of like looking forward. My sister died of breast cancer 15 years ago, and when she was in the hospital and we knew she was dying, she was almost jubilant in a strange way. It almost reminded me of like when you're about to give birth and you're just waiting to go into labor. I almost felt like that from her, that she knew that it was unavoidable and she was not scared. She was kind of looking forward to it.
It gives them peace. I found, as part of my hospice experience,
Yes.
The couple of hours, right, even the day before death,
Yeah.
there's a peace that just completely takes over, and they are joyful. I found that just through being part of the team.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. You've seen it more often.
Yes.
It was interesting. It affected me very deeply because I just didn't expect that. She wasn't very old. She was 50. She had 2 teenage kids. I would have thought, but she was ready. I don't know. It was interesting.
I think ready is probably a really good word.
Yeah.
Yeah. If in fact any of us can be ready, but in a prolonged illness, in a chronic situation, I think the circumstances are so different than in an acute, fatal situation.
Yeah.
But I think if we live Jewishly, and certainly if we participated in Yom Kippur services and have really read that text, other times other than just on Yom Kippur, I think you're preparing.
Yeah, I think it goes back to dying Jewishly means living Jewishly, and some of the original texts that we read. That's very interesting.
Yep.
Okay. So now I think we've gotten through, for me, this was the hardest part, the moments before. Okay, so the moment of death is what the next 4 texts are about, Hamet. So they raise the question of how and why we're expected to bless God when we've experienced something terrible. No matter what one's personal vision of God is, these words encourage us to see death of our loved one and our own pain as threads in a tapestry of human history. So we see it as part of life and part of the world. And that's, I think, really important. So those who are going to become mourners, the parent, the spouse, the sibling, the child, now they enter the cells of the aninut, which is the threshold in the valley of the shadow of death. From the moment of death until the burial is complete, that's where they are. And their only obligation is to arrange for the care and burial of their loved one. Most often, they're assisted by the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society. They'll guard the body and prepare it. Pronouncement of death sets in motion a series of activities and rituals, some for those present in the room, some for those who will become mourners, and some for all others who hear news of the death. Tradition includes accompanying the deceased between the time of death and the burial. Shmira, which means guarding, has a religious basis in the Talmud. The soul is considered to remain near the body until the body is buried. Shmira is practiced out of respect for the body and the soul, so that no individual is abandoned prior to burial. Preparing the body for burial traditionally includes tahara, which means purity or ritual washing, spiritual purification, and dressing of the deceased, which is performed with prayer and respect by the members of the Chevra Kadisha. These ancient rituals are the heart and soul of Kavod Hamet, which means respect or honor for the dead. Okay, these texts 10 through 14, they examine some sources of the blessing that we recite when we hear about death or other bad news, and specifically the Jewish mindset that brings us to bless God for something that's often a severe blow. Recognizing in the context of our topic that letting go and acceptance of life's end is an essential part of living. We're encouraged to see death as a natural process and part of life. So I'll read you text 10. For thousands of years, upon hearing of a death, Jews have been invoking a blessing. Those who will become mourners, those affected by the death, and all those present at the death recite this blessing in response to death and tragedy as soon as they know of it. The entire blessing with God's name is as follows. I'll say it in Hebrew. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam dayan ha'emet. Blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, the true judge. Okay, so maybe if we look at this word judge, we can see where maybe death is some sort of atonement. I never thought of it before. But others, including those who wish to comfort the person in Aninut, recite a shorter version of this blessing. And I'm sure you've seen this in every email you get about a congregation member who passes away. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge. So I can talk a little bit about where these texts come from. In the Talmud, there's a source. And here's what it says. For rain and other good tidings, one recites a special blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, who is good and who does good. Even for bad tidings, one recites a special blessing, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Similarly, when one built a new house or purchased new vessels, he recites Baruch atah, who has given us life, Shehachianu, sustained us and brought us to this time. The Mishnah articulates a general principle. One recites a blessing for the bad that befalls him, just as he does for the good. In other words, one recites the appropriate blessing for the trouble that he's experiencing at present, despite the fact that it may conceal some positive element in the future. I don't think despite the fact, I think because of the fact that it might conceal some positive element of the future. Similarly, one must recite a blessing for the good that befalls him, just as for the bad. So that's text 10. 11. This is a conservative answer by Rabbi Dr. Michael Leo Samuel. As mentioned above, in Jewish tradition, upon hearing about the death of a loved one, it is customary to say this blessing. Obviously, it is not easy to acknowledge God in a time of death. In fact, it's probably much more natural to feel resentment toward God for taking a loved one away, especially when the person who just died happens to be a young child or adult. Nevertheless, the blessing teaches us on some psychological level to acknowledge that the binary oppositions of creation, light and darkness, good and evil, suffering and prosperity, all serve a higher purpose and contribute towards the overall welfare of the world. Were it not for death, the world could not contain or sustain all of the world's inhabitants. There would be food shortages, war, and countless other social evils. Death is what we share with all that has ever lived. I love when he said death is what we share with all that who has ever lived. I also need to comment that while we know that there would be too many people if everyone stayed alive, I don't think there's a single person who ever was in the presence of a loved one who was about to die who said, oh good, now there's room for someone else. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Text 12. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Baruch atah ba'ir u'baruch atah b'sadeh. And I took a long time trying to figure out how this related to the other texts here, because we're talking about the city and the country. But if we go back to the creation, the light and darkness, and all the other opposites, I think that might be what this is referring to as well. If you have another idea, please text or say something, because that was a hard one, I thought. Okay. Rav Huna said that Rabbi Meir said, and so it was taught and a bereta in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Okay. One must always accustom oneself to say everything that God does, he does for the best. And that certainly is a motivation behind this prayer. And now, text 14, the last one before we start to discuss our question. And the rabbi said, the proof is from here as it is stated, the Lord is given and the Lord is taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You know, we always hear this at funerals. You know, Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai Mevorach. Okay, so let's think about these things. The recitation of the Dayan HaEmet blessing is the first step in the journey of the bereaved to a new reality. Do you think it's hurting or helping? I'm going to tell you how I think it helps, and then if you want to comment, go ahead. I think you step into a special place where you are kind of cradled with all the other people who have experienced this. We realize that it's not just us who lost someone who was dear to us and who were hurting, but that there are other people. This is part of life. Everyone experiences this. I think that's important. What does it mean to offer a blessing when something that is often seen as terrible happens? Well, I'm also open to comments, but I would say that two things. One, I think it's really helpful to acknowledge that we might not know everything or be in control of everything, and that in some way might be comforting. And I also think that that it's good to know that maybe something good will come of this in the future. We just don't know everything, and I think that's in a way comforting. Is God aware of our suffering? Does God suffer with us? That is a very personal thing. Donna, I know that your husband probably doesn't think that there is a God, so it's okay.
That's correct.
Yes. So you're asking this question, I'd love to hear his answer. So that's something to think about. And how do I balance holding on, anger, betrayal, loss, and pain, and weight against acceptance and moving on? So clearly we need to accept and move on. I think different people do this at different speeds, but I think the Dayan HaEmet prayer helps you to go in that direction, which you clearly have to go in. One has to go there.
I must tell you that my husband made a comment to me recently, and I understand the question. We have a Chabad rabbi here in town whose 6-year-old daughter is dying of brain cancer.
Right.
They've given her about 6 months. And he said to me, not to the rabbi, he said, how can God do that? And how does the rabbi, the father of this child, accept this? And we've talked a lot about it, and we don't come to any particular conclusions, but I think it's very helpful to talk about it. The child is really in bad shape right now. And
Terrible disease.
How do you reconcile this, being a very learned man, and it's so difficult, so difficult. How do you answer that type of question? It's a hard one.
It's a hard one. I think people who are able to say that God is wise and that things happen for a reason, I think that's very comforting for people. Not everyone can do that. If someone can take this terrible tragedy and in some way help other people with the disease, or in some way do something that helps to bring some good from something terrible. But it would be very interesting, especially a Chabad rabbi. I'd really love to know. I mean, you can't exactly walk up to him and say, hey.
It's too raw right now.
Yeah.
But I would love, actually I did ask, my grandson was recently bar mitzvahed in Denver by a Chabad rabbi. And I did pull him aside and I told him the situation. He happens to know this rabbi.
Wow.
And he said it's God's will. And I felt empty, I must tell you.
I think you have to. I know that I have relatives who are very Orthodox and they live in Israel, and that was what they would say. And,
Yes.
and they really appear comforted. I am like an anxious person. I have 3 children who I had, I really worked hard to bring them up. These people have 7, 8 kids, and all the kids are happy, and everyone's well adjusted. And I really wish that I could find that same peace. They
Yeah.
definitely have it. I don't know how it works, but I respect it.
I respect it. I don't understand it.
Same thing. I wish I did, because I think I'd probably have more peace too. But it's
You're
interesting.
all asking questions about death and about being sick. We had at our synagogue last evening a discussion about the afterlife, which was very well attended. One of the attendees is a Holocaust survivor. So that brings into question, how could God have done what he did? And it raised a lot of questions, and there is no acceptance. It's only anger, and nobody can understand what occurred. So it goes back to reading these things and saying, how do you accept it? There are terrible things, and is God suffering with us, or are we on our own?
It's a great question. I know the classic answer is that the state of Israel came out of the Holocaust. I'm not saying I feel it. I'm saying I acknowledge it, and maybe I can feel it at times. I don't know anyone who didn't lose someone in the Holocaust, obviously. It's I don't know, maybe we'll find out the answer in Olam Haba, because I don't know. It's a very hard question. Which is why the next topic, actually the next ones are going to move us towards a good thing. They are, the next text is about comforting the mourners, the Avelim. Once the body is buried, I think we can start moving towards some acceptance. And so immediately following the burial, our focus shifts from respecting the dead, kavod hamet, to nichum avelim, comforting the mourners. Avelim are mourners. And Jewish law and custom guide the mourners and the community at this time of mourning and transition. This is, I think, the part we probably most experienced, all of us, and are most familiar with and have found most comforting. The casket's covered with earth and the mourner's kaddish is recited. It's customary. I've never actually seen this done, to form 2 shirot, 2 lines in a cemetery.
Oh, definitely.
I have never actually seen this.
Conservative and Orthodox.
I was brought up conservative, but I don't know why I haven't seen this.
It was done at my mother's funeral at the cemetery, as well as a friend of mine's father.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very nice thing. I really do. And the mourners pass between that. And I think that's a nice symbol of like how they're surrounded by their community.
Yep.
And the traditional words of comfort in text 13, which I will read to you, or which I already read to you, remind us that many others have walked this path. And that's what it's all about. Many others have walked this path, and that's somewhere you can find comfort. So one of the things that are brought up also, what does it mean to offer and to receive comfort? Because what might be very supportive to one person could be sensitive and intrusive to another. So I have to tell you 2 things that relate to this, and I'd love to hear your comments. When my sister passed away, I just couldn't deal with it. I didn't even want to plan Shiva. Like, I just couldn't do it. And I was on the board of my sector where kids went. And I said, I just don't want board members coming here with entomins. Like, it's going to be so meaningless. My friend planned it. She said, listen, you just can't deal with it. She did everything you need to do. And she was right. It was comforting. But at the Shiva, one of my clients who I really like, a great guy, he walked up to me and he said, well, your sister passed away. Does this make you confront your own mortality? Like, not till you said that. So it's very interesting what people might do at this time and how the things that different people do could be seen. So the text is, may God comfort you amongst the remaining mourners of Zion, Jerusalem. Hamakom, and this is interesting, Hamakom means the place, actually. Hamakom yinachem echem b'toch sha'arei avilat Zion v'Yerushalayim. So some people say that, and then the Sephardim say, Min HaShamayim, may you be comforted from heaven. So thinking about this, what are the similarities and differences? Well, obviously, hamakom, meaning God, and shamayim, meaning God, are two different things. But in a way, it's the same. The word hamakom is used as a definite name referring to God, but it's also literally translated as the place. So I don't know. What do you guys see as the meaning we might derive from this? To me, it's just like, I mean, we don't know where God is. God is everywhere. So I think it's maybe referring to that. You're part of everywhere. You're part of everything. And that should be comforting in some way. The next text is El Malei Rachamim. And it's very familiar. It's recited at funerals, at Yizkor, and at yahrzeit observances. And I will read it quickly so that we can think about it. God, full of mercy, who dwells on the heights, provide a sure rest under the wings of Shekhinah, among the pure and holy, who cause splendid radiance in the skies above for the souls of our dear one, and you put in the person's name, and sanctify them who have gone to their eternal place. Respond, Master of mercy, protect their souls in the shadow of your wings forever, and bind their souls with the bond of life. The eternal is their heritage, and they shall rest peacefully in their places of repose. Let us say Amen. So everyone here is probably familiar with both this and the Mourner's Kaddish, and we can kind of compare them and see the differences in imagery. And you know, the Mourner's Kaddish talks about life, and this talks about, well, first of all, like I think the Mourner's Kaddish is more for the benefit of the people saying it to go on with life, whereas this is for the benefit of the person who died. May they be protected, may they rest. And in the Mourner's Kaddish, we don't say anything about this particular person, but we're just mourners. But here we're talking about the actual person who passed away. We say their name. And the imagery in this is very beautiful, I think, being protected by the wings. So that's kind of what this is like. Unlike the Mourner's Kaddish, this prayer mentions the name, doesn't require a minyan to recite, which the Mourner's Kaddish does, and can be recited anytime, anywhere, by anybody. It can be read as comforting to both the living and the dead. Because I guess if you're comforting the dead, you're comforting the living and left behind as well.
Actually, when it's sung, it's a phenomenal prayer. But it's just so significant to me. I mean, you just know that this is definitely a service of someone who's passed away, and you're giving reverence to them. But singing it is a phenomenal prayer.
You know what I'm going to do when I send out my follow-up email from this webinar? I'll include a link so people can hear it sung, because I think it's a really good point, and I think it'll be beautiful. Okay, the next text, I feel like we're coming out of the woods. The next text is about how long you should mourn. Right? Jewish ritual provides and encourages us to express our grief, but within limits. And this text talks about the limitation on how long and how much someone should mourn. So the rabbis were critical of one who mourns too much or too long. They said that God himself says of such a person, it sounds like such a Jewish God, are you more compassionate than I am? Maimonides ruled, a person should not become excessively brokenhearted because of a person's death. As it says, do not weep for the dead or bemoan him. This means do not weep excessively, for death is the way of the world. One who grieves excessively at the way of the world is a fool. With rare exceptions, the outer limit of grief in the Jewish law is a year, not more. Well, you know, there are certain things you don't do for a year, like really traditional people won't go to a party that has music. For 30 days, you don't shave and things like that. And that's what this is referring to. So why do you think rabbis would put a limit on mourning? They do that so that we will continue to live. It's like anything. You have to force people sometimes to do what's good for them. I think that's part of it. And so thinking about that, how can one continue to grieve and remember even after mourning has ended? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear. If you want to chime in, go ahead. But what I want to say is we do things to honor the person who's passed away. We might set up a scholarship fund. We might just remember things they did, tell stories about them, have pictures of them, things like that. Tell our children about their great-grandfather so that his memory lives on. How does your response to this text differ when you think about deaths at different stages of life? I have to tell you that there are activities in the end of this book, suggested activities, which I personally could never do. And if you look at them, the guy who wrote this really knows his stuff. This is his expertise. I don't think I could role play being at the funeral of a child. I just think it's weird, horrible. So, just putting that out there. In many instances today in the U.S., I've noticed that there's a trend to limiting Shiva. So what are the reasons for this is the question, and does this text still seem relevant today when people seem to be eliminating the mourning period? Well, certainly it's relevant if we're eliminating or limiting the mourning period. I think people are just like too busy to be bothered. That's my feeling. I think it's nice to have a whole week. But I think, it depends on who it is and how they feel. I don't think there's any right or wrong. If anyone wants to chime in, I'm happy to hear.
Well, is it that, or is it because certain sicknesses have such a long, prolonged sickness that people are mourning for such a long period of time that God is trying to say to them, go on, and that's why they're shortening their mourning periods?
It could be. I had a coworker who she had cancer and she took like a long time to die. And what I noticed was that her husband was almost relieved when she finally passed away. I think it was just too much for him, and he knew that there was going to be no turning back, and she was suffering. And so I can see what you're saying, that maybe 3 days is enough, or maybe it's up to the individual how they feel. I feel that the idea of being traditionally included as part of all of Jews, and in that way being comforted, would mean to kind of stay with the Jewish rituals because that's the context that you're in. But I also totally believe that it really depends on who you are and what's meaningful to you. There's really no right or wrong at all. Okay, the last text, which this is a very long book and full of great stuff. I also want to point out that, when there are several texts on the same topic, you might want to pick one or two to do with your group because there is such a lot of stuff here. So this text, the last one, it pulls together the thoughts of the entire session. That our strength as individuals and as people lies in our ability to acknowledge and mourn and incorporate losses into a new reality. It is. A Jew has died, but the Jews come together, grieve for the lost, support the bereaved, and remind one another that they and the rest of the Jews have survived. Moreover, Jews do not passively endure death and its aftermath, but have evolved customs and traditions that imply that they can transcend and dominate both. I think that's really important just to humans who want to move through this experience. You don't want to feel powerless. You want to acknowledge that it's not all in your power, but you also want to feel that you can transcend and you can go on. This text is about the community supporting the mourners, and we can discuss how the actions of the community impacts the bereaved, and supporting the bereaved also impacts the community. I think when you're bringing food to someone who's having Shiva, I don't know, there's something about it that just makes you feel comfort, and I think that's important.
What about honoring the person who passed away and what they would have believed? Like when I was sitting Shiva for my mother, one of my children had a function at school that all the parents were invited to. If I didn't go, it wouldn't have been honoring my mother and what she believed in and taking care of my kids. So I did go.
I'm sure your mother wanted you to go. That was a right.
So at that point, that's how you put part into your decision making of what's important when honoring the person who has passed.
Completely right. I agree with you. And that's one of the things to think about as we read all of these texts, that there are so many different interpretations. Like they said, every death is unique. Every experience is unique. So that's an important thing, completely. And then I want to go to the reflections questions, which are now included in every booklet. They relate to the group members' independence projects. By the way, I loved learning about what all the people did in your group. Michelle, that was cool. Anyway, so when we read these questions, these reflections questions, which you might want to do with your group, think about text 2 that we read way in the beginning. Reb Simcha Bunim, when he died, he heard his wife weeping, and he said to her, "Why do you cry? Have not all the days of my life only been so that I might teach myself to die?" So with that in mind, one of the questions for your group members, Jewish texts teach us that each soul arrives in the physical world with its own individualized mission to accomplish. Although all Jewish people have the same 613 mitzvot to guide them, each has his or her own set of challenges and capabilities with which to accomplish a special mission. So how do you define your mission? I think that's a great thing to think about, and it can give you so much satisfaction when you're alive and not wait till you're dead. And then how do your independent projects relate to your mission? So you can feel good about what you're doing. I think that's important. And then we have some supplemental materials. I have to tell you, after the supplemental materials, I have some lighter side things that I can't wait to share with you because I thought they really cheered me up. But what we have here, Kavod V'Nichum, that's where Rabbi Joe Blair is from. It's an important organization to know about. There's a link to it. It encourages and assists the organization of bereavement committees and other Kadisha groups in synagogues and communities so they can perform Jewish funeral, burial, and mourning mitzvot and protect and share the bereaved families from exploitation, provide information, education, and technical assistance. So this is a very good, organization to know. Then there are 3 resources for learning more about death and mourning in the Jewish tradition. There's My Jewish Learning, where they have all kinds of things for Jewish holidays, rituals, celebrations. And there's a nice meditation with pictures about life after death. Then Ritual Well, which is also for holidays and life cycles, Shabbat, New Year, baby namings, weddings. So there's Marking the First Yahrzeit, a complete ceremony, which is very helpful, and a complete unveiling ceremony, which could also be very helpful. Then Godcast. Godcast has usually animated videos. And here we have Preparing the Body, Shiva, and What to Do in a Shiva House, as well as to say Kaddish. They're usually very edgy, so it's interesting to watch. And then the last one I have up here, How to Give a Proper Chesed, which is a eulogy. And it's from Yeshiva University. And it's a comprehensive discussion on how to write a eulogy. So that could be very helpful to someone. Now, this is funny. So it's relating to this thing about the chesed. According to most studies, people's #1 fear is public speaking. #2 is death. So death is #2. Public speaking is #1. So that means that to an average person, if you go to a funeral, you're better off in the casket than doing the eulogy. And then I'm not making this up. I saw this. The man who created autocorrect has died. Restaurant in peace.
Restaurant in peace.
Boy, that was pretty funny. So now it is time for Q&A, if we have any. I'm so glad we've been discussing all along because I think this is a very deep topic that requires a lot of thought. Are there any questions or comments that you want? Okay, well, I really, really am glad that we did this. I was actually having a lot of trouble when I started doing this. It took me a long time to really digest all of this, and I hope it's helpful to you because it is a lot to digest, and it's very comprehensive, and it's a topic that we avoid. I avoid it. And even though we experience it, somehow we manage to experience it and still avoid it. So I think it's very good, and I'm glad that we could do this, and I'm really interested to hear how it goes when you guys do this with the group. So please let me know. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Donna, I'm going to add a link to the El Malay Rachamim. So I think that was a really good thing. So.
Oh, it's a phenomenal piece. Our rabbi has a baritone voice, and when he sings it, it just sends shivers down my spine. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of music, really.
It is. So I'm going to include that. And again, thank you guys for being here, both those people on the screen and those people off the screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on a more cheerful topic.
See you soon.
Take care.
Thank you.